It seems clear to me also that climate change is a problem we can no longer be left to a future generation. When it comes to the care of our common home, we are living at a critical moment of history.
Now, ExxonMobil, the oil giant, is recognized by the environmental community as one of the worst offenders on environmental issues. Environmental disasters from the 2013 Pegasus tar sands pipeline rupture to the 1989 Valdez oil spill have made the company a leading target of environmentalists, as has its funding for climate change deniers and its backing of organizations including the American Enterprise Institute and the American Legislative Exchange Council, known for opposing the Kyoto Protocol and other environmental regulations.
But a new investigative series by the Pulitzer Prize-winning news organization InsideClimateChange.org has uncovered that decades ago, Exxon was actually on the cutting edge of climate research. Here's a clip from the PBS series Frontline, which partnered with Inside Climate News on the project.
We found a trail of documents that go back to 1977. Exxon knew carbon dioxide was increasing in the atmosphere, that combustion of fossil fuels is driving it, and that this posed a threat to Exxon. At that time, Exxon understood very quickly that governments would probably take action to reduce fossil fuel consumption. They're smart people, great scientists, and they saw the writing on the wall.
One Exxon research project outfitted an oil tanker with equipment to measure CO2 levels in the atmosphere and the ocean.
We were collecting data of the southern Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the western Indian Ocean. Basically every hour we would get several measurements, so we had, I called it a data monster.
Today, Exxon says the study had nothing to do with CO2 emissions, but scientists involved remembered it differently.
We were committed, we were doing some serious science. It was a significant budget, I would say on the scale of $1 million a year. And that was a lot of money in 1979.
That was Ed Garvey. From 78 to 83, he was a researcher at Exxon, where he helped start the company's greenhouse gas research program. He's now a technical vice president at the consulting firm Lewis Berger, where he works on issues of environmental cleanup. Also with us is Neela Banerjee, Washington-based reporter for Inside Climate News, one of the reporters on this recent expose on Exxon. Welcome to Democracy Now! Neela, let's start with you. Why you did this series and what Exxon knew and when they knew it.
We started looking into early climate change research and became aware that oil companies, at least initially it was BP, but that was later in the 90s, had their own scientists who were looking into this. We then found out from American scientists, government scientists who'd been involved in climate research in the 80s that Exxon was involved. And what ended up happening was that I got a transcript of a 1979 congressional hearing on climate change and tried to see if somebody from Exxon was there, and I found a gentleman named Henry Shaw. Henry was Ed's boss and was the primary researcher with that tanker project. And through him and papers that he worked on, we found other names, we found documents and archives, and slowly we amassed this picture of a company that was clearly aware of the science, of the emerging science of carbon dioxide research, and what the scientists were saying, that it was largely driven by fossil fuel emissions. And they were smart enough to know that this could mean some kind of policy response farther down the road. And so to deal with that, they decided to take a constructive role, and that is to do really good science so that they would be taken seriously in any future policy discussion.
And Ed Garvey, can you talk about when you first arrived at Exxon and the research that you did there? It's an extraordinary finding, 1977. That's almost 40 years ago that Exxon itself was aware of the climate impacts of fossil fuel.
I was hired in 1978 by Henry Shaw
specifically to begin the tanker study. He hired me explicitly directly out of school. I was a 22-year-old chemical engineer, but he hired me directly out of school to begin to engineer, if you would, and design a system that could work on an oil tanker to study oceanic levels of CO2. The idea was to study what the ocean was doing in response to the atmosphere so we could figure out where CO2 from fossil fuels was ending up.
And what'd you find?
Well, we didn't get that far along in terms of the data analysis. I mean, ultimately we found, we estimated the amount of CO2 that was coming out of the oceans and the equator. My thesis advisor at the time, Taro Takahashi, used that data along with other data to estimate the amount of absorption by the ocean in the poles, amount of degassing in the equatorial area. And together he was able to estimate the carbon balance, if you would, around the ocean, the atmosphere, and the biosphere.
But why was Exxon, from what you understand, why was Exxon interested in doing this research then?
It was very much they sort of as a leadership role in many respects. The goal was that if Exxon, given the importance of the problem, Exxon wanted to be at the table in terms of the discussion. The best way to be considered viable in terms of your opinion at the table was to be doing real research. And in fact, we linked up with some of the best researchers in the world at the time regarding CO2 and the global carbon cycle.
You were working with Columbia University?
That's right.
Yes, go ahead.
As well as the Scripps Institute of Oceanography.
When did you start to feel a change in attitude at Exxon about the work you were doing?
For me, it came very suddenly toward the end of my career there. It was gung-ho for 3.5 years, and then the bottom fell out of the oil market, and it really changed. They just basically dropped the project. We had collected a lot of data, but hadn't processed it to the point of understanding the information. We just had a lot of information. Columbia went on and processed the data after my work there.
Neela Banerjee, can you talk about this turnaround, when Exxon stopped the study, what they started to understand, and how they tried to cover it up?
Well, when Ed's project was dropped from the documents we have, and talking to Ed too, it was mainly because of financial reasons. Exxon did not stop its climate research. After it started the tanker project in 78, 79, in 1980 it hired a lot of mathematicians to do climate modeling because models were primitive and they were relying on other people's models, and they wanted to do that in-house. So even though the tanker project, which was relatively expensive, had ended, Exxon continued very good, rigorous, peer-reviewed climate research, mainly through climate modeling from 1980 onward. And our documents go through 1986, and one does not notice the kind of attitude shift that appeared in the 1990s of stalling action on climate change and so on. In that period, Exxon was still committed to doing really good science. It was just different from the tanker project. If that was empirical, this was modeling. And then, the first indication that I think all of us, not just Inside Climate News, but the world have of Exxon's attitude on climate change shifting was in 1989 when a group called the Global Climate Coalition was formed. And that was a group of fossil fuel companies, major manufacturers, Americans largely, that wanted to stall action on climate change. They saw that the UN was meeting and thinking about a policy response a country should adopt to cut emissions of carbon dioxide. So what happened in that 86 to 89 period? We don't know. We can't document a shift in thinking. There's some speculation about the attitudes of the people who were in leadership then. They were different than the people who were in leadership in the 70s. But what we have is not an example of a cover-up. It's quite the opposite. What we have is an example of a company that used its resources as one of the biggest energy companies in the world to do really good research.
Banerjee, could you say a little more about this Global Climate Coalition and what Exxon's role within it came to be and how it's impacted the kind of research that's done on climate change?
Well, the Global Climate Coalition, it sounds very green. I remember thinking, oh, this must be a group of companies that actually support action on climate change. But it was led mainly by the auto industry. By the oil and gas industry. But some of the other members were coal companies, auto companies, and so on. And Exxon was probably the leader in the oil industry, working with the American Petroleum Institute, which is the main oil industry lobby. And they didn't take the approach that a lot of people who denied climate change did. And in fact, there's in public circulation, long before we did this project, a primer that a scientist had written for members about how to talk about climate change. What he recommended was not to use the arguments that other climate deniers use, such as, that it's sunspots or natural cycles, but instead to focus on the uncertainty of the science and the models, just to hammer away at that. And indeed, people who met Exxon representatives at UN conferences and other climate conferences didn't see them as sort of out-and-out deniers. Instead, they said, Exxon just focused on the uncertainty of the science and used that as a way to seed doubt about the process. So that affects public opinion, but also Exxon and others funded an infrastructure of think tanks and scientists and others who created, who issued reports and did studies that also spread doubt about climate change. And that provided the fodder for companies such as Exxon and also for policymakers to say, look, here are these credible institutions issuing these reports. There is no consensus on climate change, which is what's so unusual or sort of stark about that now that we have these documents is that Exxon in the 80s was talking about a consensus among scientists about climate change and fossil fuels. And 10, 15, 20 years later, they were saying the exact opposite.
And Garvey, as Exxon started funding these climate denier groups, your thoughts as we wrap up?
I just think it was an opportunity that was missed, that having developed this knowledge in-house, Exxon was in position to lead the discussion as how to deal with the problem, and instead they really chose to deny the problem. And I think that was really a missed opportunity. And
Neela Banerjee, the chief executives at Exxon who became the climate deniers?
Well, we don't know what their original thinking was, but we do know that Lee Raymond, who became chairman and CEO and made seminal speeches denying climate change, was exposed to thinking about CO2 and how it affected Exxon's business projects, including the decision to delay action on a major gas field that Exxon had picked up the rights to develop in the 1980s. So it wasn't that these men were ignorant of the science, but what their attitudes were when they were exposed to it, whether there was actually any kind of shift, whether it was natural or calculated, we don't know.